My name is Claire Donovan, and I'm 32 years old. The day my brother dropped his 3 kids at my door, nobody asked me a single question. He just smiled like he was doing me a favor and said the words that would swallow the next 40 days of my life. Just a few days. I swear. He had a duffel bag over one shoulder and his car already running in the driveway. My mother leaned out of the passenger window and called, "Your brother needs this." Claire. For once, just be supportive. My father, behind the wheel, gave me a small thumbs up. As if Mason walking away from his own 3 children was a decision, the entire family proudly stood behind. My sister-in-law didn't even look up from her phone. I stood in my doorway holding the youngest one's hand, already feeling something tighten in my chest. Because in my family, just a few days had never once meant a few days. Then my brother kissed the top of his daughter's head, turned to me, and said, "You're so good with them. They'll barely notice we're gone." Not. Would this be okay? Not. Can you actually handle this right now, just a drop-off? I said. Wait. How many days exactly? He was already walking backward toward the car. We'll call you. That was it. He got in. My mother blew a kiss. And they pulled away while 3 children stood in my living room with their backpacks and a garbage bag of clothes. That was the moment. Something inside me went very still. I didn't yell. I didn't cry in front of the kids. I didn't chase the car down the street. I closed the door, knelt down, and asked the oldest one if she was hungry. Because someone had to be the adult. And once again, that someone was me. But 40 days later, after the missed calls and the silence and the slow horror of realizing they weren't coming back, my phone finally rang from a number I didn't recognize. "Good evening. Is this Claire Donovan? This is Officer Reyes. We're at the address listed for your brother, and we need to talk with you about the children currently in your care." Before I tell you what he said next, and how I ended up alone with 3 kids who weren't mine, let me ask you something first. What time is it where you are right now? What's the weather like outside your window? And how far from your own family are you watching this? I want to know how far this story is going to travel. Because to understand why those 40 days broke something open in me, you have to understand that this was not the first time my family treated my life like a place to leave the things they didn't want to carry. My brother was Mason, the golden child, the one whose every decision was treated like a brave new adventure. His wife was Brooke, who believed other people existed to make her life smoother. My mother was Diane, a woman who could repackage neglect as togetherness and call a demand what family does. And my father, Gerald, mostly stayed quiet until his silence became permission. Mason and Brooke had 3 kids. 8-year-old Lily, 6-year-old Noah, and 4-year-old Ruby. I loved those children. And that was exactly the thing my family used against me. Because here is what nobody said out loud as they drove off. For years, I had been the family's emergency daycare. When Lily had the flu, I was called selfish for not leaving work. When Noah's preschool closed, Mason dropped him at my place and said, "You're better with kids anyway." When Ruby was born, my mother told relatives I had volunteered to help, which somehow meant whole weekends of bottles and bedtimes while Mason and Brooke recovered at brunch. Every time, my single, childless life was treated not as a life, but as open availability. Every time I set a limit, they acted wounded. Every time I gave in, they called it love. And the favoritism wasn't new. It was the air I'd grown up breathing. Mason was the golden one from the very beginning. When he failed a class, my parents hired a tutor and called him a late bloomer. When I made the honor roll, my mother asked why I couldn't be more outgoing. Like my brother. He got a new car at 16. I inherited his old bike. When he dropped out of college, they called it finding himself. When I worked 2 jobs to finish my own degree, It was. Claire doesn't really need our help. She always manages. Mason was the son they were proud of. I was the daughter they relied on. I learned young that those are not the same kind of love. And that in my family, my brother's wants would always outrank my limits. So when Mason said just a few days, my body understood, before my mind would let itself believe it. This wasn't a favor. It was an abandonment with a smile on it. And the person left holding it had a name. Mine. The first 3 days. I told myself it was fine. I called out of work. Bought groceries for 5 instead of 1. Set up sleeping bags in my living room. Day 4. Mason's phone went to voicemail. Day 5. Brooks too. I texted my mother. They needed a real break. Claire. Don't be difficult. The kids are happy. That word. Happy. While 3 children kept asking when their parents were coming home, by day 10, I was rearranging my whole existence. I'm a freelance bookkeeper. So I worked at midnight after the kids were asleep. Then woke at 6 to make breakfast. I missed a client deadline. I drained my savings on car seats, clothes, school supplies. Lily started waking up crying. Noah stopped talking about his dad. Ruby began calling me Mama by accident. Then looking scared when she realized, on day 14, I met my closest friend, Priya, at a coffee shop while a neighbor watched the kids for an hour. I'd barely sat down before she said, Claire, you look like you haven't slept in 2 weeks. I told her everything. The drop-off, the silence, my mother's texts, the way 3 kids had been left like luggage at a bus station. Priya listened, then set her cup down and said, Claire, this isn't babysitting anymore. This is abandonment. And they've made you the one holding it. I wanted to argue with her. I couldn't. Then my phone lit up. My mother. When I didn't answer, she texted, Stop telling people Mason left the kids. You're embarrassing the family. They're on a trip. It's not a crime to need a vacation. Priya told me to stop covering for them. She said people who abandon their children and call it a vacation don't deserve someone laundering the story for them. But part of me still believed that if I just held on a little longer, if I was good enough and patient enough, they would come back and everything would settle. By day 20, I called my mother directly. She picked up like nothing was wrong. How are my grandbabies? When is Mason coming back? I asked. Soon. He and Brooke needed time. Your brother is fighting to save his marriage. And this whole family is behind him. Mason has a real family to protect. Claire, you just have time on your hands. It isn't the same. And you know it. I have 3 children sleeping on my floor who think their parents don't want them. Don't be dramatic. They're with family. I am not their parent. You're the closest thing they have right now. And frankly, this is the most useful you've been to this family in years. That sentence landed harder than any insult. It was the cleanest version of what they all believed. My life only mattered when it could be spent on theirs. Around day 25, desperate, I called my father, hoping that just once he'd take my side. He answered. And for a man who built his whole life on silence, he was suddenly very clear. Claire, your mother and I support your brother in this. He's going through something serious. The least you can do is hold things together at home for him. Don't make us choose. Because you won't like the answer. Then he hung up. That was the moment I stopped waiting to be rescued by the people who had already decided which child was worth protecting. By day 30, I started keeping records. Because some quiet, clear part of me knew I would need them. I wrote down every unanswered call. I screenshotted every text. I kept the receipts for everything I bought to keep 3 kids fed and clothed. I photographed the note Mason had stuck on my door that first day. The one I'd almost thrown away. In his handwriting it said, "Watching the kids for us. Claire's got it. Back soon." No date. No phone number. No plan. Just my name turned into a sentence I never agreed to. On day 38, Lily asked me the question I'd been dreading. Did Mom and Dad leave because of us? I knelt down and held her shoulders. I didn't lie and promise everything was fine. Children deserve truth made gentle, not comfort built on lies. I said, "No, sweetheart. This is not your fault. Grown-ups are supposed to tell people before they leave. And your parents didn't. But you are safe with me right now." That night, after they were asleep, I finally did the thing I'd been afraid to do for 40 days. I called the police. And I called Child Services. Because 3 children had been left without a plan, without consent, and without a single phone call. And I was done pretending that was a vacation. If you've ever been forced to choose between protecting children and protecting yourself, comment what you would have done. Because that exact question circled my head while I sat on my kitchen floor at midnight, dialing a number that would finally make the truth official. The next evening, 2 officers came to my apartment. Officer Reyes was calm and careful. He had already been to Mason's house, which a neighbor confirmed had been empty for weeks. He asked me to walk him through everything. "When did your brother bring the children here?" 40 days ago. "Did he say for how long?" He said, "Just a few days." He never gave a return date. He stopped answering after the 5th day. "Did you agree to take ongoing custody of them?" "No. I agreed to watch them for what I thought was a weekend. I never agreed to this." Officer Reyes nodded and wrote it down. "Do you have anything showing that?" "Yes." I handed him my phone and a folder I'd quietly built over the previous 10 days. The note from the door. The 40 days of unanswered calls. My mother's texts telling me to stop saying Mason had left. The receipts. The screenshots. He studied them. And his expression changed at my mother's messages. He explained that what my brother had done could constitute child abandonment, and that because the children had been left without a custody arrangement, Child Protective Services would need to assess their situation. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because their parents had vanished. He said clearly, "Ms. Donovan, you are not in trouble. You may have kept these children safe for 40 days. But that does not make you legally responsible for them. And you were never required to be." My family had counted on the opposite. They had bet that my love for those kids, and my fear of looking heartless, would be stronger than my instinct to protect myself. The CPS caseworker, Ms. Okafor, arrived the next morning. She was gentle with the kids and direct with me. She confirmed the children were healthy, Phil, and clearly attached to me, which she noted I had managed with no support. Then she asked the question that mattered. "Did anyone ask you? Or get your agreement? To take responsibility for them?" "No," I said. "They were left here. I was told it would be days. It became 40. She wrote that down. "We will need to locate the parents. Until we do, we'll determine a safe arrangement. You are not obligated to keep them. And you should not feel forced to. Just to avoid conflict with your family." I looked at Lily, Noah, and Ruby coloring at my kitchen table, and my heart broke in 2 directions at once. I loved them, and I had been used. Mason and Brooke surfaced fast once the police started calling. Funny how that works. Suddenly, the phones that had been dead for 40 days lit up. Mason called me. Furious. "What did you do?" CPS called me. "Are you insane? I called them because you abandoned your children at my house for 40 days. I said, "We were figuring out our marriage. You made it sound like a crime. It is a crime." "Mason, it's called abandonment. And you signed my name to it." He arrived at my apartment that evening with my mother and Brooke, all of them ready to make this my fault. Officer Reyes happened to still be finishing paperwork. And Ms. Okafor asked everyone to sit down and talk in the open, which I think terrified them more than any private argument could have. Mason opened with, "This is a family misunderstanding. Ms. Okafor looked at her notes. A misunderstanding doesn't usually last 40 days, with no contact. Brooke's jaw tightened. Claire offered to take them. She loves them. I never agreed to 40 days. I said, I agreed to a weekend that you never came back from. My mother turned to me with the disappointed look she'd weaponized my whole life. Claire, this is not the time to make a scene in front of strangers. 3 children had been abandoned. Police and child services were in my living room. And somehow, in my mother's mind, my honesty was still the emergency. Officer Reyes asked, plainly, who decided the children would stay here? And for how long? Nobody answered. Then he looked at Mason. Did your sister agree to ongoing care? Mason said, she would have come around. She always does. So she didn't agree. Officer Reyes said, she was being difficult. Brooke said, that's not a yes. I said, Mason glared at me. You're really doing this in front of cops, over your own niece and nephews. No. I said, you did this when you left 3 kids at my door and disappeared for 40 days. The room went still. For the first time, the sentence sounded exactly as bad as the thing it described. My mother reached for the softer weapon. Claire. Sweetheart. Nobody meant any harm. You're just so good with them. Mason and Brooke were struggling. People need help sometimes. Then they should have asked for help. Instead of leaving their children and turning off their phones, I took out my phone and read it all aloud. 40 days of call failed. My mother's text, stop telling people Mason left the kids. Brooke's silence. Mason's note with no date and no number. Ms. Okafor wrote steadily as I spoke. My mother's face changed with each line. She had expected me flustered and apologetic. She had not expected 40 days of evidence. That was my first real taste of a different kind of power. Not revenge as destruction, but revenge as documentation. Ms. Okafor explained that the incident would be fully recorded, that the parents would be required to demonstrate a stable plan for the children, and that the abandonment would remain on file. Officer Reyes added that depending on the findings, there could be legal consequences for leaving minors without arrangement for that length of time. Mason's confidence cracked. Consequences. They were with family. They were left without consent or a plan. Officer Reyes said, that's the issue. Brooke started to cry. Not for the children, but because consequences had finally walked into the room. My mother whispered, Claire, look what you're causing. A year earlier, that sentence would have destroyed me. But sitting there with 40 days of proof in my hands, I finally saw the trick. They caused the harm, then handed me the shame to carry. I said, I didn't cause this. I just stopped hiding it for you. Mason leaned forward. If you let this go on record, I'll tell everyone you stole my kids and turned the family against us. I smiled, and I think that scared him more than shouting would have. Then I'll show them the note, the one with no date and no number. In your handwriting. My mother stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Maybe she was. The old Claire would have folded. The old Claire would have kept quiet. Kept the kids. Kept apologizing. And let the family rewrite 40 days of abandonment into a generous favor. The woman in that room was finished paying for love with her own erasure. After everyone left and the children were settled with a relative, the caseworker approved. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote the most important letter of my life. It wasn't emotional. That was the point. Emotion was what they twisted. Facts were harder to bend. I wrote Claire Donovan. Did not consent to assume custody, guardianship, or ongoing care of Lily, Noah, or Ruby. The children were left at my home under the stated expectation of a brief stay and remained for 40 days without contact or arrangement by their parents. I am documenting this to make clear I was never a consenting caregiver. Only the person who kept them safe in the absence of the people who were. I attached the photo of the note, the call logs, the texts, and the receipts. I emailed it to Mason, Brooke, my mother, and my father, and blind copied myself. Then I saved it all in a folder labeled Family Boundary Documentation. It felt cold. It also felt like the first full breath I'd taken in 40 days. Then I called Priya. She answered on the first ring. "Tell me you finally called someone." I did. "Police and CPS." She exhaled. "Good. I'm proud of you." That sentence landed without a single hook in it. 2 days later, my cousin Raina sent me a screenshot from a family group chat I'd muted weeks earlier. Mason had written, "Claire called the cops on us and tried to take our kids because she's jealous. She doesn't have her own." Brooke added, "Some women can't stand watching a real family struggle and survive." My mother replied with a praying hands emoji, and "We are heartbroken by her choices." Then the relatives piled on. Aunt Carol shameful. Uncle Dean family handles things privately. Someone I barely knew. This is what happens when a woman has no kids of her own to understand sacrifice. I felt the old heat rise. But it wasn't guilt this time. It was precision. I asked Raina, "Are they saying I agreed to keep the kids, and then turned on them?" She replied, "Yes. Mason says you offered 11 Brainas, 9 patient. Then called the police out of nowhere." So I did exactly what Priya had told me to do. I wrote one message and posted it to the group chat. For clarity, I never agreed to keep the children. They were left at my home for 40 days with no contact and no plan. After I was told it would be a few days. The police and child services documented that I did not consent and that the children were abandoned. I won't discuss the kids publicly, but I will correct false claims about what I agreed to. Then I attached one image. The note from my door. In Mason's handwriting. No date. No number. Just watching the kids for us. Claire's got it. Back soon. Silence. For 9 perfect minutes. Nobody typed. Then Raina sent a private message 40 days. I had no idea. Aunt Carol deleted her comment. Uncle Dean left the chat. My mother called immediately. He let it ring. Mason texted. "Take that down." I replied. "Stop lying." He wrote. "You're humiliating Mom." I replied. Mom told me to hide it. That was the second taste of power. The first had been documentation. The second was refusing to protect people from the truth of their own handwriting. But the group chat was only the start. Word spread that the children left for over a month. The question circulating quietly flipped. It was no longer "Can you believe Claire?" It became "They left 3 kids for 40 days. The story had turned, and it turned because of one undated note they couldn't charm their way past. Then Miss Okafor called again. "Ms. Donovan, your brother and his wife are now claiming you were part of an agreed arrangement and changed your mind. We'd like a written statement to keep the record accurate." I almost laughed at the desperation. That's false. And I have 40 days of proof. Please send everything to the case file, along with a signed statement. My fingers went cold. But not from fear. From clarity. They had tried to turn my care into a crime of mine. Now the very evidence they'd ignored was protecting both me and the children. That night I wrote my statement. With dates. Prior incidents. The texts. The silence. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't need to. 40 days was heavy enough on its own. When I finished, I read the last line twice. I love these children. But love for a child must never be used to trap an adult into a responsibility she never agreed to carry. If that sentence struck something in you, ask yourself this. How many times have you called it love when it was really someone else's escape route? The formal meeting happened the following week. And this time I didn't go alone. Priya came with me. Not to speak for me, but to sit beside me as proof that I had someone in my corner who gained nothing from my silence. Ms. Okafor was there, along with the supervisor and Officer Reyes. Mason and my mother arrived late. My mother carried a folder like a lawyer, though it held nothing but printed photos of me with the kids at birthdays, as if smiling beside them in pictures proved I'd agreed to raise them. My father came too, and sat in the back, looking smaller than I remembered. Ms. Okafor explained, the meeting was about establishing what had happened and ensuring the children's safety. Mason jumped in. Exactly. Claire is making this sound criminal. But it was just family helping family. The supervisor asked, who left the children? And for how long? Nobody answered. Officer Reyes said, records and a neighbor confirmed the parents' home was empty for approximately 6 weeks. My mother stiffened. They were taking time for their marriage. You left without arranging care. The supervisor said, and without your daughter's agreement. Brooke wasn't there. But Mason muttered, Mom said Claire was fine with it. My mother shot him a look. And for the first time I saw a crack open between them. Manipulation only holds while everyone shares the same story. Under questioning, their accounts drifted apart. Mason said Mom had assured him I'd handle it. My mother said she'd been sure I'd do the right thing because I always had. My father admitted he'd known. I said I could only take them for a weekend. The supervisor wrote it all down. Their own words built the record better than mine could. Then my mother slid her photos across the table. Look, Claire loves them. She's always been there. The supervisor looked at the pictures politely. Loving a child does not make an adult legally responsible for them without consent. I wanted to frame that sentence. Mason rubbed his forehead. So what happens now? Ms. Okafor explained that the parents would be required to complete a parenting and stability plan, that approved caregivers would have to be confirmed in writing going forward, and that the abandonment would remain documented. If there were another incident, it could escalate into a formal neglect case. Mason stared at me like I'd invented the consequences. Are you happy? I answered honestly. I'm relieved. Ms. Okafor turned to me. Ms. Donovan, would you like it on record that you are not a caregiver, guardian, or emergency contact for these children unless you personally agree in writing? Yes, I said. Immediately. Mason looked panicked. But what if we need help again? I looked at him clearly. Then you ask someone who agrees to it, in advance, with a date. He said, quietly, there's no one else. And there it was. The truth. Finally out loud. They had no plan because their plan had always only been me. The meeting ended with signatures. Nobody had expected forms and written acknowledgments. The revenge wasn't loud. It was blue ink on white paper. Mason had to sign that he understood I was not a caregiver. My mother had to acknowledge in writing that she had no authority to assign the children to me without my consent. Afterward, Mason caught me near the door. Did you really have to post the note? Did you really have to disappear for 40 days and tell everyone I stole your kids? He looked down. We were drowning. I didn't know how to ask. His face crumpled. Because someone had finally said out loud that they'd been drowning. And that drowning people had still left 3 children behind. He whispered. Mom kept saying, you'd never actually call anyone. I know. And she said this was the most useful I'd been in years. I swallowed the anger in my throat. I was always useful. You all just never respected what it cost me. He didn't apologize then. But he stopped defending it That was the first honest thing he'd done. When I walked outside, my mother was waiting by my car. "You've changed," she said. I opened the door. "No, Mom." I just stopped turning, being abandoned into a favor I was grateful to do. Then I drove home with the windows down, even though it was cold, because for the first time in 41 days I wanted to feel the air move around me without a child's question I couldn't answer or a phone that wouldn't ring. The fallout came in waves, and each wave carried off another piece of the family that had survived on appearances. First, Mason and Brooke were required to complete a supervised parenting plan before regaining stable custody. With documented caregivers and check-ins, Mason complained that the system was tearing his family apart. Nobody said it to his face, but people noticed that the system was just the word he used for the consequences of leaving his kids for 40 days. Second, my mother's reputation took a hit she never saw coming. For years, she'd been the matriarch relatives called for wisdom about keeping a family together, but they just needed a vacation. Does not survive next to 40 days. No contact. Aunt Carol sent a quiet apology. Raina told me cousins had started comparing stories and realized my mother had spent years rewriting who agreed to what, using guilt as a schedule. Third, Mason and Brooke had to actually arrange and pay for childcare and support, the very things they dumped on me for free. The cost stunned them. Mason picked up extra shifts. Brooke sold things she'd bought for herself, posting online that priorities change when family stops showing up. I almost replied. Family showed up for 40 days. Free labor finally quit. I didn't. Sometimes growth means letting the obvious line stay unsent. A few months later, something shifted. With a real plan in place, the kids stabilized. And they were doing better, because their care was finally built on structure instead of on someone else's guilt. Mason called me one evening, and for once he didn't open with a demand. "We've got a real routine now. I'm not calling to ask you for anything." A long pause. Then, "I'm sorry. For all of it. For the 40 days. For what I said. It wasn't everything." But it was the first time he'd named the thing instead of excusing it. So I answered carefully. "Thank you. That means something. And I need you to never leave a child at my door again without asking me first." He was quiet. Then, "Okay. That's fair." That word, fair, wasn't an apology for everything, but it was a border, and he'd finally stopped trying to step over it. I still see Lily, Noah, and Ruby. I visit when I choose to. I bring Ruby the stickers she loves and let Noah beat me at cards and listen when Lily talks. But I show up as their aunt now, on my terms. Never again as the place their parents leave them when they don't want to be parents. The first time I visited after everything, Lily climbed beside me on the couch and whispered, "Mom says grown-ups have to ask before they leave someone with someone now." My eyes burned, but I smiled. That's a very good rule. 1 year after that 40th day, I moved into a small place of my own and slept through the night for the first time in what felt like forever. On the first evening, I sat on the floor among half-unpacked boxes and opened the folder labeled Family Boundary Documentation one last time. I expected bitterness. Instead, I felt gratitude for the woman who had kept 3 frightened children safe for 40 days with no help. And then, when it was finally over, chose truth over a comfortable lie. The woman who looked at an undated note with her name on it and refused to let love be turned into a cage. I archived the folder. I didn't delete it. Some lessons deserve to be kept where you can find them again. Then I turned off my phone and slept better than I had in over a year. So if you're listening to this and you're the dependable one, the single one, the one without kids, the one everyone praises only when you're useful, the child your parents rely on but never quite protect, hear me clearly. Being the family scapegoat is not a role you were born to play forever. Your worth is not measured by whether you have a spouse or children. And it does not shrink just because your parents chose to pour their pride into someone else. Your home is not a place to leave the responsibilities other people don't want. Your love is not consent. Your guilt is not a contract. And real family does not crown one child and bill the other. Then vanish for 40 days and call it a vacation. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if your own family left their children at your door and never came back? Because I used to believe that calling for help would destroy everything. It didn't. It only destroyed the version of the family that needed me to stay silent and keep carrying what was never mine. We hope this story gave you both feeling and a lesson worth holding on to. This video is entirely fictional and created only for entertainment, educational, and reflective purposes. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Choosing to protect yourself from people who only value your usefulness may cost you their approval, but it can give you back your whole life. A key to your home is not a key to your whole life. For years, my family treated my door like a place where responsibility could be dropped off without a question. A date. Or a plan. They mistook my love for those children as permission to disappear. And they called my exhaustion selfish because it was easier than calling their abandonment by its real name. But a handwritten note does not become consent just because it has your name in it. Children deserve adults who make plans, not adults who hide behind the person most likely to feel guilty. Protecting them did not mean letting their parents rewrite the story. It meant making the truth official. So Lily, Noah, and Ruby could learn something better than the lesson my family tried to teach, that love is not a cage, help is not ownership, and being dependable does not mean becoming the place where everyone else leaves what they refuse to carry. Scriptwriter, Nguyen Van Chien.